My Forgotten Classics series, this movie deserves to be watched. It's a 1994 movie about the horrible conflict, civil war in Macedonia in the early 1990s. This is one of the first movies from the newly founded country of Macedonia. 1994's Before the Rain, highly recommended, and here's why, coming up next. This movie is written and directed by Milcho Manchevski, his very first movie. It ends up coming off a lot like Krzysztof Kieślowski, the Polish director, whom I really love. That's a high compliment from me. And for those of you who have seen Pulp Fiction, appreciate it, even like it, I think this movie, which came out in the same year as Pulp Fiction, will please and delight you. Its actual structure is, it's in 3 parts, 3 stories. They're told in succession, story 1, story 2, story 3, but they're all interlocked and interrelated thematically, as well they're little Easter eggs as each story is told, connecting all the stories together. And the stakes are much higher than Pulp Fiction. Here you've got Macedonian Christians, I think, versus Albanian Muslims in a horrible conflict. Although the movie is set at a very local level. You'll have a village, you'll have a monastery, just a few people appear in this movie, so it doesn't show you this whole grand civil war, but it is gesturing towards these humongous, social and national events, as well as global effects of the Civil War. The first story is about a young monk at a monastery. Most of them are older monks at this monastery, and he finds an Albanian Muslim girl who looks a lot like a male with their hair cut short in his cell one night. This monk has taken a vow of silence, and then when the Macedonian Christians with AKs and machine guns and other weapons show up at the monastery demanding to search it because they want to find this girl, who they claim killed one of their family members, will the monk reveal her identity or not? With this movie, I can't spoil anything for you if you've never seen it. The second story is about a British photographer who somehow interacts with the first story, but we see her back in London. She takes photographs, and some of the photographs are pop culture, Madonna, for example. Other photographs are about the Macedonian Civil War, and we can compare the seriousness versus the unseriousness of photography, and how pictures, whether they tell us the whole story or not. She is actually in a love triangle. She's married to a man, but her lover is a Macedonian who ends up being the star of the third story, where he goes back to Macedonia to his own local village to see his family. These 3 stories are titled Words, Pictures, and Faces, as if, the faces that we see can be transformed into language, either a visual language or linguistic language, such as words. And the question, how do these 3 things, words, pictures, and faces, interrelate, and how do they shape and move us when we see a civil war? The question of whose side is right and wrong in the Civil War, and how is that communicated? The movie is openly asking questions about itself and trying to describe a civil war to you through images and words, obviously with the screenplay, and with faces, which are the actors substituting for real people. I strongly recommend this movie if you like puzzles, if you'd like to see how 3 stories interrelate, and if you'd like to understand perhaps how any civil war can go terribly awry. The movie, I think, is very spot on about how individuals, complex people, get caught up in civil war, sucked into it. The moral conundrums they face are unthinkable and unsolvable. As well, then, civil war has a nasty logic of violence, an either-or split between people, where real life is far muddier than that. When you talk Christians versus Muslims, it seems obvious one side versus another, except when you get to meet people on the ground, and that's what this movie is kind of showing, I think. And that's where I want to begin spoiling the movie, because we need to talk briefly about how these movies interrelate and analyze it a bit. So here's the spoiler alert. Now, I find the first story and the third story obviously end very similarly, with a group member shooting a member of the same group, the Muslim shooting the Muslim girl in the first story, the Christian shooting the Christian man, culturally, at the end of the third story. This idea that civil war violence has this kind of logic, where if you're not on my side, you're on the other side, and I can shoot you, and that means the sides are more important than the war, than even family ties. This is supposed to be very disturbing in the movie, obviously, but it also means that the logic of civil war sort of breaks itself down. Christians shooting Christians, Muslims shooting Muslims in order to gain some advantage or to get revenge in civil war. And then obviously the second story, which may be a little trite, is that of course the civil war affects not just people only in Macedonia or Albania or those areas, but also far around the world. That civil war can extend to various parts of the world because obviously we're living in a more global scenario where we're allowed to travel freely from country to country, sort of. And then the logic of the second story is very similar. Someone gets shot who is innocent and gets caught up in a war that they aren't even a part of. So of course that's one parallel between these three stories. Someone gets shot and a brutal thing happens, horrible things happen at the end of each of the three stories. Why is this story told out of order, with the beginning really being the middle being the end, and the ending being the beginning? That is, the third story is really the first story chronologically speaking. There's a quotation, it's graffiti I think in the movie, the circle is unbroken or the circle is broken, whatever you want to say. The question of violence, is it self-perpetuating? Is it cyclical? People commit violence and then that spurns more violence and then it's just an unending cycle. I think is one of the ideas of the circular structure of this movie. You can't break out of the cycle of violence, it would seem, given this movie's achronological structure, in which the beginning and the end sync up in full circle. The girl is running toward the monastery at the beginning of the first story. Obviously, in the third story, she's running away to the monastery. So that is the circular structure of this plot, and that's why I said it's kind of like Pulp Fiction. The movie has great music. I think I could listen to the soundtrack by itself. The cinematography is quite good. If you can get an HD version of this, there was one I watched. Now this is February 2021, streaming on Criterion Channel. They only have a DVD of it, but hopefully they'll come out with a Blu-ray, because I think this movie is still very interesting, somewhat timeless, and yet of its time. And so for all those reasons, I can highly recommend this movie from 1994, which, as many people know, a great year for movies, with Shawshank and Pulp Fiction and a bunch of other American movies. But this movie, maybe one of the top movies from that year, so try it out. What do you think of this movie? Have you seen it before? Let us know in the comments, and please subscribe to this channel for more great content, for more forgotten classics like this. Thank you. Have a great day.